Hi, I'm Thorsten, and today I'm going to talk about the 5 most important books in my collection. This challenge started with BunkmastaB calling out a bunch of creators on YouTube, and he claims that it originated in BJ Kicks's live stream from a couple of weeks ago. I went back to check on it because I wanted to take a screenshot and put it up here, but I think at this point, I think Ben made it up. So I call it the BunkmastaB Challenge, the 5 most important comic books in my collection. A couple of other creators already accepted Ben's challenge and published their videos about the 5 most important books in their collection. So there's Steve from DBC All-Star and Jake from The Brave and the Boys who published their videos. I'm going to put a link in the description down below so you can find those. And who knows, there might be more that are following. But here's the list of my 5 most important books in my collection. So let's define how I deem a book to be important and important enough to be in this list. It is not based on its value, on its quality. It is more based on what it means to me and how it helped me in my journey, in my comic book reading journey. Those books helped me understand what I like in comics and why I'm reading what I'm reading and why I like what I like. So let's get started. Before getting to the actual 5 books, and Ben told me if you're not cheating, you're not trying. So there's an honorable mention I want to kick this off with, not part of the 5 books, mainly because I don't actually have that book in my collection. All the other books I have in my collection, this book I do not, which is why it's an honorable mention at the beginning. But it is Hägar the Horrible, which is a book I devoured as a kid. When I was in elementary school, I read probably all books that I could get my hand on in that series. I know Hägar started out as a comic strip in a newspaper, but when I got my hands on it as a kid, those were collected editions. So we're already on theme here with collected editions. But Hägar the Horrible was like my go-to comic as a kid. I love those stories. Unfortunately, I don't know where those books are. My mom probably gave them away at some point. Again, that's been over 30 years ago. But in regards to my comic book reading journey, this is the earliest recollection of mine that I can think of, where I was reading and devouring comic books. So Hägar the Horrible definitely kicked off my comic book reading journey. And for that, it has to be mentioned here in this list, even though it's not part of my collection. But let's get to the actual list. So first off, there is Lucky Luke. Lucky Luke being a book that I, in my early teens, came to appreciate. And the reason why it makes my list of 5 most important books, it's because for the first time, comic books were more than just funny stories to me. While reading Hägar or other titles of that time satisfied my entertainment need as a child, Lucky Luke really is the first book where I realized that there's more possible in comics than I had thought. Lucky Luke, for those who don't know, regularly integrates actual people in its pages. Historically important events are being integrated into the story. And so there you have an underlying learning effect when reading those stories. And real life characters showing up in those pages kind of opened my eyes to what's possible in comics and that it is more than just funny stories. And as there are more and more Lucky Luke comics still coming out, one of the more recent ones from 2020 is A Cowboy in High Cotton that features a black sheriff of the Wild West that was a historical character, a real character. So they're still continuing that theme to this day. And by now there have been over 80 issues published of Lucky Luke, obviously long after Morris died. And those stories are continuing. Lucky Luke is still coming out. And if you haven't, definitely go and check out a book. If I had to use an example of what it was like me as a kid reading those comics, I would pick The Bridge Over the Mississippi. Definitely one of my favorite issues. That's why I put it up here to represent Lucky Luke as a whole. But yeah, if I had to pick one book out of my collection that stands for Lucky Luke, it would be that one. Next up on my list is Earth X, created by Alex Ross, written by Jim Krueger, and illustrated by John Paul Leon. The way this series started was back in '97, part of Wizard magazine. Alex Ross wrote an article about a dystopian future of the Marvel universe, and people liked it so much. He published a sketchbook, and that was sold out quickly as well, so that Marvel then decided to make it its own series, which later became not only Earth X, but was continued with Universe X and then Paradise X. Now available in 2 omnis, you can collect the entire original series. I didn't know about the backstory or the story itself when I came across this series. But the reason I'm listing this here as one of my 5 most important books in my collection is that this series got me hooked or introduced to superhero comics, to Marvel comics. Prior to that, I was not really exposed to any other superhero comics. I knew who Spider-Man was, I knew who Batman was. I mean, there were TV shows, right? But in comic form, I hadn't really read any superhero Marvel or DC comic books. So heading to a comic book store with my friends when I was 16, 17, so around the year 2000, shortly after Earth X started coming out, I fell in love with the covers. Alex Ross art just stood out so much that I have to have those books. I remember a friend of me telling me, it's like, if you start this, you kind of go down a rabbit hole because you don't only have to collect this one or get this one and read one particular single issue, but you will have to read the whole story. And I was like, I don't care. Those covers just looked so amazing. They drew me in. They were like embossed covers, Alex Ross art. And I remember also falling in love with the story. And then later on, hunting down all the other issues. I got those first in single issues. Later, I tried to hunt down the trade paperbacks. And then I was so glad a few years ago when this finally came out in omnibus format. But think what you will about the story. I don't think there are many that think this is the greatest Marvel story ever. I don't think there's probably anyone that would claim that. But to me, I had no pre-exposure, prejudice of what Marvel characters should be like when I first got my hands on this book. So whether characters behave out of place, I mean, they're meant to be behaving out of place. But if that's to some not in continuity, and obviously it's not in continuity, it's on Earth 9997. It's an alternative reality in which basically everyone on Earth gains superpowers, and the superheroes that have existed until then either further mutate or have to deal with, or they both have to deal with everyone else having superpowers as well and redefining their role in society on Earth while still battling this dooming threat and trying to solve the puzzle that is what gave everyone superpowers. I do like the story. I do like the entire arc, and later on when they end up in limbo and in the different realms and just all of it. But that's my bias of it being the first superhero Marvel comic book that I read. It's not only part of my reading journey, but a big milestone in me actually wanting to know more and going down rabbit holes that I hadn't gone down previously. And again, look at those Alex Ross covers, right? I mean, every single one of them is a smasher. And there should be a collection of oversized Alex Ross, Earth X, Universe X, Paradise X covers. I have those all in single issues, but definitely that art deserves oversized treatment. Next up is Joker by Brian Azzarello. And the reason why I'm including this is This being the first book that gave me this alternative perspective on comic books and what they can do, exploring a little bit more than just a great story or even darker aspects, different characters, but exploring philosophical questions, exploring a little bit darker realms of the psychology of those characters. I try to avoid spoilers for all of the books I'm discussing here, so I don't go too deep into the whys and whats. But reading Joker by Brian Azzarello first opened my eyes to like, okay, we can go down different paths. And I am aware that other books had done that previously. They had done that before Azzarello wrote this book. To me, that was the first book that I read where I kind of expanded my mind, expanded my horizon, just because I hadn't come across those other books at this point. And as part of my reading journey, that was very important to me. That got me hooked back after leaving comics for a few years, kind of brought me back in and made me keep reading more, made me wanting to read more. And without that book, I don't know if I would still be reading comics, because I might have just chalked them off as entertaining but not thought-provoking, which this one definitely is. Number 4, Batman by Tom King. To me, the best Batman story ever written. And while that's a very controversial claim, I know I'm going to get some comments here. To me, this is part of why I'm reading comics, exploring the psychology, the decision-making of characters. Why are they the way they are, and what makes them the way they are? What drives their decisions, and how can you manipulate their thoughts? This is not a story about the Joker, so stop complaining that the Joker doesn't behave like the Joker. Actually, I think he does. He's not the main villain in every single Batman story. And if he takes a step back in this, that's actually on point. But Tom King here manages to reference and honor so many previous stories. He has an important character from Batman Year One showing up. And he honors Nightfall and kind of like compares it, or expects you to know about Nightfall for this to be even better. You have Flashpoint that definitely plays a big role in this. So you need to know a little bit about the DC history to appreciate this even more. But even without all of that, what Tom King does here is a mental analysis of what makes Batman happy, and picks themes of the Mask of the Phantasm and integrates those here, adapts them, and again compares, no spoilers, but if Bane in Nightfall broke Batman's physical spine, definitely here Bane attempts to break Batman's mental or emotional spine. How he does that, I'm not going to tell you. But I'll, in the future, definitely have to make a video just on Batman by Tom King and why I think this is the best Batman run ever written, and go into more details. Because I know it's very controversial, and I don't want to use this video to explain all of those thoughts that I have. So it's definitely going to be a video in the future, in the more distant future, because there's a lot to unpack. But to me, this book is so important because it made me think so much about the various players here and what makes Batman tick. It defines and kind of uncovers what makes Batman work. How can he be broken? Not physically, but mentally. You have different story arcs there that explore that in depth. And how it can recover, how he can recover, what he has to do to get out of there, where he relies on others like Selina to help him out of it, and what he does and what he doesn't do when she's not there. Why she's not there, again, that's part of the overarching theme of how to break Batman, and it's all the manipulation coming from certain players in this book. But definitely a great arc. If the first story arc doesn't hook you, you're not alone. It doesn't kick off great with Gotham and Gotham Girl. Like, that part kind of doesn't do this series any favors. But if you make it through the first arc, even the second and third arc, it makes sense as a whole. You can't judge any arc by itself. You have to read it all for it to become this masterpiece, this story that in and of itself is just genius. And again, don't judge any story arc by itself. It's all interconnected. It's a story that reaches from the beginning to the end, with certain characters showing up and certain other characters acting in the background that you don't know about yet, that you will get to later on. I own this in various formats: single issues, trade paperback, signed trade paperback. And if I had to pick one book, because I know this isn't meant to be like, oh, this is my most important series, I have to pick one book. What's the most important book in my collection? And in that case, I'm probably gonna go with a signed single issue by Tom King of issue number 50. And issue 50 in itself is controversial. I had to read it a couple more times to understand why it had to end the way it ended, and that it makes sense in the bigger scheme of things. But again, this single issue being representative for the entire run. Number 5, last but not least, is Daytripper, my most favorite comic book of all time. This is a comic book I would recommend to anyone who isn't reading comics and use as an example of why they should be reading comics, what you can do with the medium, how you can explore certain themes, certain topics in a book and be thought-provoking, being engaging without really explaining too much, explaining the what, and more presenting a story as is. One thing I will say though is you gotta stick through this for at least 2 issues. That's 2 issue minimum. I know there are some people, and I'm looking at you, Astonishing Melanie, who stop reading after 4 pages because it's not for them. You have to make it at least through 2 issues to understand what the author is doing, what Fabio Moon wants to do. And paired with Gabriel Bar's art, this just makes it a masterpiece. Again, my favorite book of all time, has to be in the list of my most important books ever. In my collection, I own the trade paperback, but I also own the Absolute, so I'm going to go with the Absolute edition here. And if you haven't read the series yourself, the less I say, the better, because the first time I read this, I didn't know anything about it, and it made it so much better. So I'm not even going to give you a premise or anything, or any spoilers, anything that could be a spoiler. I'm just going to tell you, trust me, go out, read this book. The less you know, the better. And thank me later, but definitely make it through more than 4 pages. And there you have it, the 5 most important books in my collection. But wait a minute, you might say. I know there are some, looking at you, Ben, losing their minds right now. How could you not include The Many Deaths of Laila Starr? I tell you how. You expected it, and I like to surprise. So of course it's part of this video as well, as an honorable mention in this case, because I didn't want to use that spot for something that you already know I'm going to include. So The Many Deaths of Laila Starr being an honorable mention here, because that's basically the book that kicked off this channel, that made me reach out to Ram V and Philippe Andrade and interview them, that made me want to talk more about comics, and using that as a reason to start this channel and just talk about things that I like here. And reaching out to Ram V and Philippe Andrade, definitely the highlights of last year, being able to interview Ram V and discussing The Many Deaths of Laila Starr in depth for over an hour. Check out the interview if you haven't. But this video wasn't about my most favorite stories. It was about the top 5 most important books in my collection, and the way I defined importance was how they contributed to me changing my reading patterns, what I liked in reading, how I realized what I like and what I wanted to read more of, and where my reading journey was going or whether it was continuing at all. And therefore, those are the books that definitely had a huge impact on me. My most favorite 5 books. I might one day make a video about my most favorite stories. But for today, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.